Hi, I'm Femi OK, and this is The Stream. Today, did the United Kingdom steal the Chagos Islands? We discuss Britain's occupation of the Indian Ocean territory. So if you want to join the conversation, tweet us, and I will do my best to include you in the show. British Prime Minister Theresa May is defying a United Nations ruling that Britain illegally obtained the Chagos Islands and should return the archipelago to Mauritius. This is Al Jazeera's Nadine Barber explaining why returning the islands is not that easy.
In 1965, Britain split the remote Chagos Islands from Mauritius, 3 years before Mauritius gained independence. The new ruling says that was illegal under international law. Then in the late 60s and early 70s, Britain evicted almost 2,000 Chagosians to Mauritius and the Seychelles. That was to make way for construction of a US military base on the largest island, Diego Garcia. Decades on, many live in poverty in Mauritius, where the largest Chagosian community is based. But several thousand now live here in southern England, following a decision in the 1980s to grant some Chagosians British citizenship. And they've been campaigning consistently for the right to return.
We heard from one of those Chagosians living in the United Kingdom, who talks about what it's like to be in exile.
Physically and psychologically, it is torture. It is revolting and humiliating to know that we are being made beggars of what legitimately belongs to us. We are being taken advantage of just because we are a small Black community without any network to seek help.
So Chagosians are anxious to return home, and Mauritius wants its territory back now. But Britain has extended the US lease of Diego Garcia until 2036. What is next? Here to discuss. In Grand Bay, Mauritius, Robin Madam Udu is a lawyer representing the Chagosian refugees. Here in our studio, we have David Vine. He's a professor at American University, author of The Island of Shame, The Secret History of the US Military Base in Diego Garcia. And Mark Rosen is a retired US Navy captain and senior vice president at CNA. That's a non-profit research and analysis organization. Gentlemen, it's good to have you here. Let's start with some black and white photographs. Robin, thank you for sending them to us. I want to go back 50 years to see what life was like before Diego Garcia was Diego Garcia, and it was a little archipelago where people actually lived who weren't involved in the military. This picture here, talk us through, Robin. Why did you send us these pictures?
Well, I think it shows a totally normal life which they had there until the military base came in. You will know that this was in early 1960s when the States wanted an island in the Indian Ocean for a military base. And the UK said, well, be our guest, go and look for your island. So the American Navy went and looked for an island for their base. They found Aldabra Island first, but Aldabra was not convenient to them because on Aldabra there was a unique turtle population, and they did not want to disturb the turtle population. So they went to their second best choice, which was Diego Garcia. And they did not hesitate to forcefully evict the indigenous people on Diego Garcia and on Peros Banos, and we know the rest.
This is quite a vicious story in terms of how the Brits decided to get people off the island. They stopped them from coming back if they went off to have hospital treatment. They rounded up animals and pets and gassed them, and they starved them in order to get this prime piece of real estate. You're looking at what happens with military bases around the world. Is this an unusual story, David?
Sadly, in the case of the US military, it's not. I've been able to document around 20 cases just in the past roughly 100 to 120 years where the US military has forcibly removed local populations, usually indigenous populations, as part of the construction or the expansion of US military bases. So the Chagosian story is sadly not unique. Some people know about the people of the Marshall Islands who were displaced during nuclear testing, in Vieques, Puerto Rico, Okinawa, Japan, just a few of the many cases in which similar acts have taken place.
So I'm just thinking, Mark, you've been to Diego Garcia. Did you have any sense that this was disputed territory when you were there, when you were in the Navy?
No, I mean, the U.S. has had a long-term the original lease term was for 50 years, and it was recently extended for 20 years through 2036. I mean, the U.S. is basically, I don't want to say exclusively a tenant. We are the major occupant of Diego Garcia. However, we relied upon the British government in order to provide us access to the base. And insofar as some of the items that were mentioned by David, in all my time working on base issues for the Department of Defense, I mean, we always tried to ensure that there were adequate opportunities for the local population, respect for environmental laws, and things of that, and we spent a lot of money on it. Now, obviously, the standards that were back in the 1960s were probably different than those today. And so in the case of Diego Garcia, I think we need to rethink exactly, in terms of the U.S. relationship with Mauritius and the displaced people and their descendants. We need to rethink on how we're going to deal with that.
Robin, what occurred to me was the pain with which either the descendants or actually people who still remember living on the Chagos Islands, the pain with which they remember where they came from, that it was such a beautiful place for them. I want you to have a listen to Olivier here, and he puts that into words every time I hear somebody who's from the Chagos Islands about what they're missing, why they want to go back home. Have a listen to him.
The UK government, who present themselves as champion of human rights, banish the fundamental rights of our people. How could we accept that other people can live on our birthplace, whereas we, as native, we cannot do so? And at the same time, we have our parents who buried in Chagos, which we don't have access.
Come here onto my laptop. This is a tweet from Marie Sabrina Jean. Marie Sabrina Jean was going to join us today. Unfortunately, she had to work, so I'm going to bring in some of her social media. She says, Chagos is not for the UK, it's not for the USA. Chagos is for Chagosians. It's time for the UK to give us our paradise island. Robin, you've been trying to do that. How much ground are you making right now? How close is it to being Chagos for Chagosians?
Well, I think it's pretty simple, but it's just made complicated by the shameful refusal of the United Kingdom and the United States of America to comply with the rule of law. Before the 25th February 2019, that is before the ruling of the International Court of Justice, well, Mauritius had claims, the Chagos Islanders had claims. But no more. These are no more claims. There is the highest court of law in this world that has ruled that the UK's continuing occupation is unlawful, that UK must bring an end to its occupation and must return the indigenous people there. And that, this right is an erga omnes right. Every state, every country must help in putting an end in this. So this is not a claim, this is not an allegation, this is the rule of law, this is a declaration of law. I mean, I still remember when Catalonia claimed independence, Theresa May went online and said Catalonia has to comply with the rule of law. Well, I'm sorry, Mrs. May. It's your turn now to comply with the rule of law.
Well, Robin, this is Mark. I too am an international lawyer, and a couple of points. And I want to reinforce what I said earlier, that the United States needs to perhaps take a leading role in trying to address the concerns of the displaced Chagosians and work with the Mauritian government to try to come up with a reasonable accommodation. And I would agree with you that there was a Lancaster Agreement that was negotiated in 1965 that granted rights to Mauritius, to fisheries, to mineral rights, and a variety of other things. And I don't believe that agreement has been fully honored. And in fact, there was an arbitration over the UK's designation of a marine protected area that so much as reinforced that point. that all terms in the Lancaster Agreement were not met. However, an important point is that is an international legal tribunal that did not say that the UK's continued occupation of the Chagos was illegal, and now we have an advisory opinion that says that it is that the detachment was improper. So I mean, yeah. So I would say that the United States and the UK have acted in good faith up to now, and now
you would.
Good faith in terms of meeting their legal obligations.
Robin is laughing at you.
Well, that's fine. But in terms of meeting their legal obligations. Now, there's moral and ethical things that I said in the Lancaster Agreement that I think that need to be addressed. But again, go ahead.
Mark, I'm sorry. That's a new definition of good faith, I have to tell you. I mean, we are all here to state our point. But I mean, it's very well documented that U.S. Congress was misled. Everybody was misled into making the world believe that those islands were unpopulated. I mean, the circumstances of removal, and we are at the end of the 1960s here, for God's sake. I mean, these people were treated like animals. I mean, I will send you the whole documentation, and you will tell me whether if these were Americans, these would have been accepted. Full stop, no. There's no good faith. There cannot be good faith when such honorable states like UK or US mistreat people like this. So I do grant you the fact that now we have a new situation, and I am so positive that the US government will take the lead and will come to a reasonable conclusion to this matter. In fact, you know, Mark, I'll finish by this. There is not much difference between Mauritius' position and the U.S. position on this. Mauritius has never asked the military base to go away. Mauritius is very open, and the Prime Minister has made that declaration officially. We are ready to grant a lease to the U.S. government for the military base. I mean, how close can we get, and how ridiculous the situation is?
True.
And indeed, this is an international dispute that could be solved very easily. The Chagosians, most of them, are also not calling for the removal of the base. Many of them would like to work on the base, given the deep poverty that many of them are living in. And of course, we have US military bases around the world that have civilian populations living right next door. Even Guantanamo Bay, where the supposed enemy is living on the other side of the fence line. Tomorrow, Chagosians could go home. There's housing where current civilian employees are working on the base. They could also go back to live on the islands other than Diego Garcia, which are more than 100 miles from Diego Garcia, where many of them were born, where their ancestors are buried, where many of them want to go back. And of course, you know, they've been suffering in exile for now more than 50 years.
Can we unpack that just a little bit? Because we've already talked about how basically Chagosians were rounded up because there was a very lucrative lease to be had with the United States. So the Brits leased Diego Garcia to the United States. They rounded people up and they dumped them around Mauritius. That dumping, can you explain the consequences of that? And when you go and find Chagosians today, which you have, how are they living?
So on the whole, the Chagosians have, since they were, as you said, dumped in exile in Mauritius and the Seychelles, they've been living, generally speaking, as the poorest of the poor in both islands. These are, you know, they're living far removed from the tourist beaches that some people might associate with Mauritius and the Seychelles. They were dumped with no resettlement assistance. They received very small amounts of compensation 5 and then 10 years after the last removals, so by which point many of them were living in profound poverty. And what many of them talk about as profound sorrow for being separated and torn from their natal lands, the land of their ancestors and their birthplace.
And some are in the UK, so some have managed to be in the UK as well.
Only since 2002.
Yeah.
Many of, now upwards of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 have moved to the UK in search of a better life because their lives in Mauritius and the Seychelles for most of them have been so painful.
I just want to emphasize what it is that is so important, so special about Diego Garcia, that the United States, knowing what has happened in the past few years, the past few decades, and the UK, continue to hold control of that island. This is Con Hallinan. He is a journalist and an analyst for foreign policy, and he just explains in a nutshell beautifully the lure of Diego Garcia. Have a listen.
The importance of Diego Garcia is its location in the Indian Ocean. It's able to dominate the east coast of Africa, the west coast of Pakistan and India, as well as the third largest body of water on the planet. It also is able to control access and entrance to the Persian Gulf and to the Red Sea. It played an enormously important role in the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and it currently plays an important role in the war in Syria and Somalia. And if there is some kind of confrontation between the United States and Iran, Diego Garcia, with its deep harbors and its large airfields, will be ground zero for any kind of military confrontation with Iran.
All right, that just sums it up. Why would America want to give up the lease? Why would the UK want to give up? I mean, is he ever going to go back?
Well,
But Femi, I'm sorry, nobody's talking about giving up the lease. I mean, this is a misconception.
Sure.
The Americans can stay there. Nobody has asked the American base to go away.
So thanks, Robin. That's the importance of why the Americans are there.
yes.
But then what do you do? Because we're still in the same situation we were over 50 years ago. So
Right.
nothing's improved.
Well, in my opinion, I generally agree with the individual who just spoke about the strategic importance.
Yeah.
And if you look at some of my prior articles, I mean, it's got two 10 or 12,000 foot runways in the middle of the Indian Ocean, which if you have long range, like B-52s and other long range aircraft, you can launch strikes, thousands of miles. In addition, what's very important is that it's an area which doesn't have a large population. And so that if there was ever an attack on the US base there, or the British base as well, or the ships that are there that are part of the Marine pre-positioning force, there would not be any real significant civilian casualties. So it gives the US a certain amount of freedom of operational action. And then last but certainly not least, the location is so critical because it is relatively isolated and somewhat irreplaceable. And I do have a point of order. The US does not actually pay a cash payment to the British government.
They pay it in arms?
No.
Discounts?
No, they don't.
Well,
I mean, there was an agreement called the Trident Sales Agreement in which the United States waived certain costs of development of Trident missiles many, many years ago. But the history of the United States and the UK in terms of basing has not been where the US has ever paid them a lease payment.
They haven't, but effectively they transferred $14 million to the British government. It was one of the ways, as Robin said, that the US government, the US military, evaded Congress and parliamentary oversight by, rather than asking for an appropriation of $14 million, they simply wiped away the debt that was owed.
I don't know. That's 1965. I don't have those kind of records, but okay.
But no matter
so, General, I'm going to push you because we're shockingly at the end of the program very soon. There are ways to resolve this. Robin, you said nobody's asking to give up the lease. So
right.
Can Chagosians go back? Robin?
Femi, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
All over the place, all over the world, there are American bases next to civil population. All over America, all over Hawaii, all over South Korea, all over Japan, all over Europe. Why cannot the Chagos Islanders be resettled in the Chagos Islands? I mean, let's forget about Diego Garcia for a minute. Peros Banos is the other island, which is about 150 miles away from Diego Garcia.
All right, that's a good question. Let's ask our military, our naval man, Mark, why can't we go back close by?
I would actually have to look at it, but in principle, I agree with you. There's probably areas where there might be some limited resettlement. Candidly, most of the people, when they were evicted from the base, were working on a large coconut plantation, and also they were just living their normal lives. So if there's opportunities for them perhaps to engage in agriculture, that's fine. But I think, frankly, the thing that's the real riches there is the water. and the fisheries. And so trying to involve those people in some of the economic activities, involve them in employment at the base, I think that's the path to success for those that want to come back there.
Mark, I'm confused about one thing, and Robin, if I may, is that even if you can't go back to live on the Chagos Islands where you left, your ancestors and their where the burial grounds are, the cemeteries, you can't even go back and visit those. Why?
I don't know that, but
Okay.
I think that some accommodation that would allow people to go and visit those sites could be reached.
I don't understand the stubbornness that's going on here. Do you, David?
I think, Mark said that word freedom a moment ago, and I think sadly the U.S. military and the U.S. government have prioritized their freedom of operation, as Mark put it, over the freedom of the Chagosians to live where they want to. And sadly, I think, racism is clearly a major part of this story. This is a population of African...
We didn't even mention that. We just assumed that it was happening because of #colonialism.
Yeah, this is colonialism in the 21st century. This is a colony. It is Britain's last created colony that the United States military has benefited from at the expense of the Chagosians, whose interests and lives have been trampled upon for now more than half a century, when indeed this entire problem could be solved and Chagosians could be paid reparations for what they have suffered at a small fraction of the total costs of billions that have been invested in the base.
TJ says here on Twitter, since Mauritius is a sovereign nation and it has always maintained that it has sovereignty over the Chagos archipelago, certainly UK need to hand control over to Mauritius. That is one scenario that might happen. Konstantinos has another one. Have a listen to what he has to say.
Earlier this year, the principal judicial organ of the United Nations told the UK government to return the Chagos Islands to Mauritius as soon as possible. The UK government had participated fully in the court proceedings, presented its case, but its arguments were rejected. Now the UK government rejects the findings of the court and says that it will return the islands at some point in the future when they're no longer needed. So what's next? Now it's the turn of the UN General Assembly to make its move and act on the advice it has been given by the ICJ.
Here on Twitter, Abdul Wahab says there will be consequences. The UK is already struggling internationally, and this will leave it floundering and isolated. Robin, are you hopeful that the UN can fix this?
Well, of course I am. In the beautiful advisory ruling, paragraph 179, the judges, the court, put that onus on the UN General Assembly to fix the modalities over which the islands are going to be returned and the Chagos Islanders are going to be resettled. And in the next paragraph, 180, the court says this is an obligation on all the states to ensure that sovereignty is returned to Mauritius.
How long is that going to take, Robin? We're at the very end of the show. How long is that going to take?
I hope that the US and the UK this year take the very good decision to put an end to this barbarity.
Amazing. Extraordinary. But that's Robin being optimistic. David?
Femi, I'm sorry. At every day there is at least 100 sailors camping on the islands. Where is the security threat there? Sailors going to Perros Bandos and can camp there and do barbecues and volleyball parties. And why can't the Chagos Islanders go back there?
One last thought in a sentence, Mark, if I may. Go ahead.
Well, yes, an accommodation needs to be reached.
Yeah.
Whether it can be done, it's going to be a little tricky for the U.S. because, remember, its rights are derivative of those of the UK.
Right.
So it has to work in tandem with the UK.
All right, David?
This problem could be solved tomorrow. Governments and people around the world need to continue to put pressure on the British and U.S. governments, who are increasingly isolated internationally and are becoming international pariahs and have really trampled on the human rights of the Chagosians.
There's not every international situation where you can see such an easy solution. We feel that there's certainly an easy solution in this case. Robin? Maybe you'll be right. We shall see. Thank you, gentlemen. We continue online always at AJ Stream on Twitter. Thanks for your company. See you soon.